First bell. Ooh-wee. I think I went to bed last night at 8:45 and still tired. It's bad news, isn't it? Say that again. Oh, I know it. Yeah, listen. December, I'm always thrilled because of everything that we do, and it's so much fun. But now, Christmas Eve night, like 7:45, 8 o'clock. Oh, I cannot wait to just get home and get by the fire. So it's terrible, So, well, good morning. Hope y'all are doing well. Couldn't be better, or could be better? Could be better. That's right. That's right. Well, the alternative, right? So it's just all context, right? Yeah. So it's how do you frame it? All right. A couple of announcements. Tomorrow, some of you I think might have. Last Wednesday night, we had Earl Nichols from the PI at our. He did a teaching on grief, and he's going to do a follow up to that on tomorrow. So if you're interested, or if that's something tomorrow's really going to be geared towards getting through the holidays, particularly when it can be a sad time as much as a joyful time. So he'll be with us tomorrow night after supper. And then the following Wednesday night, the 13th, is our last Wednesday night supper. That's also the night of our children's musical. For us here, next Tuesday is our last meeting before we break for the holidays. We do not have anybody signed up for refreshments. So if you would like to have refreshments, and then moreover, if you would like to bring refreshments for everybody else, right? So just kind of raise your hand or put down on the prayer list that you'll do it. But our last Tuesday, next Tuesday, and then we'll figure out when we want to start back. Services for us during the holiday time. The 24th is on a Sunday. We'll have one service in the morning. That'll be at 11 o'clock. Then we'll have the two candlelight Christmas Eve services at 4 and 6. The 11 o'clock Sunday morning service, we will not serve communion. So we're going to serve communion at 4 and 6. But it's just one service. Some Sunday school classes have asked. Sunday school is autonomous to some degree. So if your class wants to meet, y'all want to meet. If not, don't worry about it. But 11 a.m., one service in the sanctuary, two services in the sanctuary, 4 and 6. The 4 and 6 will be candlelight. And then for December 31st, we're just going to have one service, 11 a.m. All right? So for all you Georgia fans that are kind of grieving, we're just going to have one service for you, because I know how that's going to feel the next day on New Year's Day when you join the ranks of Auburn and not playing for a national championship. So anyway, good on the announcements? All good? I notice how Bitsy's not saying a word. She's just sitting back there, just relaxing, Those Alabama folks are just kind of taking it in, no problem, don't have to say anything, it's just. My Brooke? She's doing well. I mean, she has, Caroline had a cold, a little bit before Thanksgiving, the beginning of November. Brooke went up to Nashville for Caroline's pop concert, and she came back with a gift. And so she's got a nasty cough that she can't get rid of. And so, but she feels okay, roughly. I appreciate you asking. Wrong Brooke. Yeah. So, that's right. Yep. Was she visiting one of y'all? Were y'all in the emergency room? So I mean, yeah, no, I mean, no, not my brook. So all square there. Um, yeah, so don't know. I mean, it might have been a family member that we just don't know about yet. So I mean, you know, so. Oh no, that's not me. Yeah, nope, different Brooke. She's all good. She went to the doctor, but not to the emergency room. So, all right. Any other announcements or questions? I want to say a word of he's not here, but Glenn Martin filling in last Tuesday. Glenn is a Methodist minister, retired, and served faithfully in our annual conference for goodness decades and decades and decades. And so he and Vicki retired back to Columbus. That's Stephen Brinkman. Many of you remember Stephen. That's Stephen's father-in-law. So that he does. He and Vicki both sing in the choir, and they last night or Sunday, the Messiah, very very active. So, Glenn also runs for our annual conference the sort of like the emergency response group, like if tornadoes or hurricanes or something like you have to be trained to do that, and he and a handful of others they train at churches. But they're normally first in right after a storm, so very very active. They don't let me touch the machines. I have a tendency to try to cut my finger off and slice my leg open, and so I've been kicked off the first response team. So, all right. Any other announcements? We're all good. So prayer pad, we'll send it around. I want to say thanks to Betty Hips for years since I think COVID, doing the email for us, and I think now it's just predominantly just a duplicate work. So we're just going to go back to the old way of filling it out, then making a copy and distributing it after the break. All right, all good? All right, well let's pray and we'll begin. Oh God, for today we give thanks, as always, to gather in your name to study. We're after a certain type of study, not just what the text says, but we want more than that. We want not just the meaning, but we want the meaning to be applied to our life under the direction of your Spirit, so that what's formed inside of us is the nature of Christ. We know it's process-oriented. To some degree, it's fluid as we move with heart and head and hands closer into something that reflects your image in the world, specifically your image through your Son. So we want to be open to that again, and if in our time of study and fellowship that can yield that type of end, that's what we pray for. And we pray it for ourselves, for those that are around us, and just anyone who studies here. We ask for your presence and your guidance, and we pray this in your name. Amen. Before we get started, a number of people have asked about maybe a good book or a resource to maybe understanding at least some of the beginnings or the source of conflict, particularly in the Middle East. There's a good book. It's not necessarily theologically based, but it's a good book for social and political differences called From Beirut to Jerusalem. It's a guy by the name of Tom Friedman. It's fairly old. He was I think he was either UN or U.S. representative in that area for 10 or 15 years. If you just want a good book for explanations, From Beirut to Jerusalem, I've ordered one book, about to order another, and once I read those, I'll give comment on that one if I think they're okay. One of them I've ordered is a little more of it's going to take some of what Friedman does and then maybe look at it also through a theological lens. So anyways, there's been probably a handful of folks that have asked John and me, and if that's something you're wrestling with or would like, it's a good book to read. So Tom or Thomas Friedman. I'll get Kathy to give the link like to Amazon or something and send it out to the group. Now I've read that book. It's been ages, but I mean it's one that I've always thought of as this is a good explanation about some of what leads to the ongoing conflict over and over and over. And it's his reflections after spending, 10, 15 years in the region in some official capacity. And it's not a judgment on either side or anything like that. It's just to tell you, if someone didn't know anything, this is probably a good place to start. So it's called From Beirut to Jerusalem. All right? So, okay, let's go in. So last week, Glenn walked you through chapter 7. And, just to sort of kind of bring us back all up to the same place from one week to the next, what the Hebrew writer is doing, first and foremost, he's writing to encourage his congregation. And he wants to encourage his congregation not to revert back to an old way of life. And the way he does that is he takes Jesus and through different means or different aspects will explain, elaborate, teach that Jesus as high priest. And so there's this connection that runs throughout the book of Hebrews where he looks at old priests, maybe say Melchizedek or Aaron, and shows that he compares them to Jesus, and then he'll contrast them to Jesus as well, all with the idea that everything that they sought to establish in Old Testament, Jesus takes that as a foreshadowing of it, and now ushers in a new covenant, and this new covenant is the culmination of everything leading up to Christ. And in chapter 7, the main push from the author is this connection between Jesus and Melchizedek. And Melchizedek as a shadow or foreshadow of the Son of Man to come. That's actually what he mentions in the first part of chapter 7. And Melchizedek being of such status that Abraham gave him a tithe. And vicariously then all the descendants of Abraham, which the Levites were part of, who were also the priestly class in Israel, they vicariously give a tithe to Melchizedek because they're from that same lineage. Now, the Hebrew writer in chapter 7, it's not the first time, but he spends all of chapter 7 doing this, makes this connection between Jesus and Melchizedek. What makes Melchizedek who he is because he's priest and king. Remember, that's not the first time we looked at that. That when we are introduced to him in Genesis chapter 14, his title is that he's priest of the Most High God, and he's king of a certain region, the king of Salem. And Jesus is compared to Melchizedek from the Hebrew writer because Jesus is priest and king. And this is, again, chapter 7 is not the first time the author introduced this concept, but he's bringing it to sort of a completion, or at least to an apex, a high point. And that's all what chapter 7 revolves around. And the difference between Jesus' superior, say, to Aaron's line, or the Levitical line of priests. The latter part of chapter 7 is a good summary, and it's just basically comparison. This old covenant, old way, foreshadowing into something in the new. Levitical priests, they were descendants of Levi, or from Aaron, and so there were hundreds and hundreds and thousands of them throughout the ages. But Jesus, high priest, just one. They were temporary, as in what they died physically. At the same time, their work was temporary compared to something that's permanent and eternal. They were sinners, so they had to sacrifice for their own sins before they could sacrifice for the many. Again, this is not the first time. I think in chapter 5 is where he spent a great deal of time talking about this. But you compare that to Jesus, not sinner, holy, innocent, sacrificed for others. They, that is, Aaron and his descendants, needed daily sacrifices. Jesus just once and for all. They sacrificed animals, and the whole Old Testament has a whole litany of what they would be, and the animal was normally determined by what the fault or the sin. And so they used animals for sacrifices. Jesus offered himself. They could enter into a holy place, but the holy place was, again, just a shadow of what it was like in heaven. And they could only enter into that by means of the blood of an animal. Jesus doesn't enter into something that's a shadow. Jesus enters into the holy place in the presence of God, and he does this by his own means. He doesn't need anything in order for him to make that type of entrance. So what chapter 7 does, at least under the concept of priest, the Hebrew writer brings what he was writing about for a number of chapters up to this apex, or at least brings it to some level of a conclusion, with the idea that Jesus is king and priest and superior to those that came before him, whether it be Aaron and Aaron's descendants, or even Melchizedek, this guy that we meet in Genesis 14, and then he's mentioned one other time in the Psalms, and then other than that, we don't know. All right? When we get to chapter 8, I don't know, let's see, chapter 8, I have the ESV. Verse 1 begins with, now the point in what we are saying is this. How do y'all have what does your Bible read, or how does it read for the first part of verse 1? Yeah, here's the main point. What do you have? Okay, who has anything other than the main point of the point of what we were saying? Yeah, all right, okay, good. All right, so, and all of them are in right. I mean, it's what he's doing in chapter 8, and he's going to go from 8:1 to 10:18, is now that we've established all of this, and he's been working on it for a couple of chapters, what's next? You know, how does that play out into other aspects of this concept of priest, temple, sacrifice, sanctuary? And what he's going to do is he's going to tick them off. And he's going to do that for a couple of chapters. Now that he's established that Jesus is high priest, what does his ministry look like? And what does his ministry look like in those areas, or with those things that a normal priest would conduct himself with? Things like covenant, things like sanctuary, or you can put holy place, and then actual sacrifice itself. For 2 chapters, this is what he's going to deal with. So he's going to take the next step, that because Jesus has been established as high priest superior to any other, he's priest and king, let's get to the finer points of it. Maybe that's a better way of saying it. All right, so that's what we're going to look at in chapter 8. But before we go there, let me stop for a minute, see if there are any questions, comments, anything unclear. All got it? Good? I have 3 heads nodding. All right? Get like a bubble head, you know, So as we're looking into chapter 8, this is the main, when I was preparing for this, one question I asked of myself, and because it's probably over the last 2 or 3 years, I'm fully convinced that we do underplay. So just here's the question. Do we underplay the efficacy, the ability to save, or the salvation that is ushered in? Do we underplay the efficacy and the magnitude of Jesus as our high priest? All right, so we don't have to answer it just yet. I just want you to think about this, because this has probably been a reoccurring question that I've been just focusing on over the last couple of years. Now, this is not the first time I've asked you this question, And so, I mean, I think you know my answer is I think we totally do. I mean, I think we, and some of this probably is clergy fault, all right? So in preaching and teaching, our response to Jesus, which is normally disciplines, what you do because of, we have a tendency in the church to focus on that more than just the sheer magnitude of the gift of salvation that God gives. And I mean, and to some degree, it's like the finite trying to understand the infinite. So there's an acknowledgement, A.W. Tozer, remember a couple of years ago looked at A.W. Tozer. He's like probably lower than C.S. Lewis for some, right? So A.W. Tozer whenever we talked about the attributes of God, he said, we need to have a huge disclaimer that says, we're in the kiddie pool trying to understand something from the deep end. And so, but with that said, we can study the attributes. So I'm convinced that, and this was probably an evolution in my theological thought or maybe in my ministry, that we really do underplay God's gift of grace and its ability to save. Because most of us still sort of live in this, to some degree, a works righteousness mode of how we might act. What we rank our sins, we rank our works. I mean, we have a tendency to plumb line it, or to totem pole it, and that's really just not even. It's hard to even justify that in the New Testament. I mean, when Paul writes, it is. We are nothing more than just beggars begging for something. And the fact that we receive something is just a gift from God. That's not to make you feel bad or to feel shameful or guilty or anything like that. If anything, I hope it would do the opposite, and it would make you, you would feel freed, because it really is that overwhelming and that efficacious. So anyway, so there's I've waved my, I've kind of, put my hat in the ring. But I want you to think about it. Do we underplay the efficacy and magnitude of Jesus as our high priest? All right, since we're looking at the book of Hebrews. So, because we're going to, for 3 chapters or so, he's been writing about how wonderful Jesus is, and that Jesus surpasses anything that anybody that's been connected to God in the past. Jesus surpasses all of that. And so, I mean, it's just, it's down here, everybody else, Jesus way up here. And when we get here in chapter 8, he's going to sort of pull back the rocks and say, okay, what does that really mean for us in terms of our covenant? What does that really mean for us in terms of sacrifice? What does that really mean for us as the entrance in the holy place and in connection to God? And he's going to do that for a couple of chapters. So over the next couple of weeks, well, now that we only have one more week before we break, so probably for about the next month or so, I want you to think about, do we underplay the efficacy and the magnitude of Jesus as our high priest? All right. So that being said, here we go. Let's look at verses 1. We're going to go to 1 to 7, because the way that the chapter breaks down is 1 to 7 is the first part, and then 8 to 13 is the next. And 8 to 13 is dependent upon 1 to 7. So let's look at that. Now, the point in what we are saying is this. I think Harriet's, the summation of it. Where do we go next? We have such a high priest, one who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven, a minister in the holy places, in the true tent that the Lord set up, not man or not by people or person. For every high priest is appointed to offer gifts and sacrifices. Thus, it is necessary for this priest also to have something to offer. Now, if he were on earth, he would not be a priest at all, since there are priests who offer gifts according to the law. They serve a copy and a shadow of the heavenly things. For when Moses was about to erect the tent, he was instructed by God, saying, "See that you make everything according to the pattern that was shown you on the mountain." But as it is, Christ has obtained a ministry that is as much more excellent as the old, as the covenant he mediates is better, since it is enacted on better promises. For if that first covenant had been faultless, there would have been no occasion to look for a second. All right? So there we go. We'll just go kind of unpack this verse for verse. Having established the superiority of the high priestlyhood of Christ, the author now is moving on to these secondary themes of covenant, sanctuary, sacrifice, which are the same things that Aaron and all the descendants of Aaron's were closely associated with. So that's why he's just going to the next level of what does it mean for Jesus to be our priest. Melchizedek gave way to Aaron, and then now Aaron is giving away to Jesus. That's probably a better way to look at it if you want to see it via timeline. And because, from Aaron or from Melchizedek to Aaron to Jesus, then he's talking about in terms of high priest, he's going to make that same logical connection then with everything that took place in earthly sanctuary, and he mentioned that in like tents made by human hands, is going to give way to heavenly sanctuary. Okay? So he's just taking, everything that was established in, these previous chapters, he's just going to apply that same logic, that same theological construct into everything that Aaron or a priest would conduct themselves with. And in this case, where do they sacrifice? All right, so Aaron sacrificed where? Where did he sacrifice? Old Testament. Where? In the wilderness. Outside, yep. So in a tabernacle, basically just tents, if you can imagine multiple tents. And you don't have to do this today, but if you want to read something that's incredibly boring, which I know that you want to, right? So, read the second half of the book of Exodus, all right? So when I mean the second half, I think it's like after, so 19 and 20 is when, so in chapter 19, God and the children of Israel, they have a covenant ceremony. Chapter 20 is the Ten Commandments. Then after that, oh my word, it is like watching paint dry, because you read all the qualifications of the tent. And it's like you've got to, this can only be 15 feet high, and it only can go for like 60 feet, and it can't go an inch more. It is, an engineer and architect would love it. They'd probably geek up and get all excited about it. Someone like me read it, I'm going, oh, let's just get to something else, right? But it was incredibly exact on how it was supposed to be built. And so Moses, remember, Exodus is 7 trips up the mountain. All right, so Moses goes up the mountain and comes back down 7 different times. When he receives the 10 Commandments, that's the 4th trip. So it's not just, that's the one that we always highlight, but there's multiple times he goes up and down the mountain. On the mountain, presence of God comes down the mountain, gives what he received to the people. One of those trips was the 10 Commandments. Another trip was all the specs for the tabernacle. And the tabernacle was, while they were in the wilderness, they didn't have a permanent place. The tabernacle was to be the place for the presence of God. All right? So just think back to your Old Testament Sunday school lessons. Whenever Moses was going to visit God, he would, consecrate himself, go into the tabernacle, all these different layers of tents, and then there would be a cloud that would descend down, presence of God. They would work it out. Cloud would go up, Moses would go out. And so when the Hebrew writer mentioned this, that this sanctuary or this holy place or this tent, it was, even though specs given by God, it was still human-made. All right? So that's where Aaron would mediate on behalf of the children of Israel inside that tabernacle, because that tabernacle was a place for God here in the wilderness with the children of Israel, but it was like miniature. It's just a temporary shadow, and to some degree with the specifications, maybe miniature of what it's like in heaven. Okay? That's the comparison that the Hebrew writer is making. Now, the tabernacle lasted for a number of centuries until after the conquest. So Joshua leads the children in, so you go through all the different judges, and then you get into the kings. Well, when Solomon builds the temple, the physical place, the temple, then becomes the replacement for the tabernacle. Tabernacle no longer needed because now it's replaced with the temple. So when we talk about this idea of where Aaron sacrificed, original Aaron sacrificed in the tabernacle. Some of his descendants in the tabernacle, but some of his descendants in a temple. And when you read about all the different specs for the temple, it is just as boring. All right? And I mean, it really is. I mean, this room, and the temple is, are y'all, can I erase this? Are y'all good? All right. So the temple, as the tabernacle, and you probably have seen this. You can't see it now if you go to Israel because it's no longer there. But you can. Some of you have been to Israel, and before you go in, like under the temple, and you can look at some of the foundations of it. You watch a video, and so the temple is nothing more than just a series of courts. All right? So the biggest area is the court of the Gentiles, right? When Jesus cleans out the temple, in the Gospels, it's in this area. All right? So after the court of the Gentiles, you have the court of the women. And you could only go as far as whatever the title was. So Gentiles could only go to here, say over there. Women could only, Jewish women could only go into there. And then you have the court of the men, or the Israelites. And then you get into where you have like the priest and then the Holy of Holies. Okay? So it's nothing more. And so the tabernacle was just like this, just with a tent. You had a big tent, then you had another tent, and then another tent, and then another tent, and so on. When they built the temple, it's with structure. It's not with tents. And like this is where they had the temple treasury. Remember where you have the passage in the Gospels where you sound the trumpet, all right? So they, if you can imagine like a reverse trumpet, they had different collection boxes that were the end point was the size of the money. The money was like quarters, pennies, nickels, things like that. And so whenever you threw it in, you could hear the sound going down, and then it would be connected into a box. So when Jesus says, don't come in here sounding the trumpet because you're thumping it with some big money compared to some guy that's doing it with a penny, right? So that's just extra. So, but whether it's in the tabernacle or in the temple, it's still something that was given by God as in the specifics, whether we're reading about it in the book of Exodus or whether we're reading about it in, what is it, Kings, or I can't remember, it's either Kings or Chronicles, where Solomon gets the directions. And it's not just the directions, it's what's to be gold, what's to be wood. I mean, so he's, God gives him, the drawings, and then Solomon, built it, or at least tasked other people to build it. And the same is true with Moses, giving it to the children of Israel. Tents or permanent structure in the temple, either way, that is a dwelling place of God, and it's only a shadow of where Jesus mediates. They would interact on behalf of the people in a temporary lodging. Jesus does it in some place that's permanent. All right, so when you think about, all right, he's a superior high priest. Well, where does he conduct his business? Does he do it down here in a tabernacle or temple, or does he do it in some place that's even better than a tabernacle or temple? Well, what the Hebrew writer says, he does it up here in the presence of God, not some place that's temporary. All right? So, again, what earthly sanctuary or earthly tabernacle or temple, it gives way to, say, heavenly place. The sacrifices in the temple, they were temporary, almost like placeholders for something that was more effective and eternal. So you just see where the Hebrew writer is, he's made this theological argument about Jesus as our priest. Well, what does that mean? Well, anything that a high priest would do, Jesus does it in a superior way, superior place, and eventually it's going to be superior sacrifice. It's not going to be with animals. It's going to be with himself. We don't get that until chapter 9. But, he's just going to make every application to Jesus as high priest. What does that look like for us? Okay? And in here, at least in chapter 8, he starts off with Jesus is part of a better covenant. And the first aspect of that is where it takes place. Well, it doesn't take place in the tabernacle. Doesn't take place in the temple. It actually takes place in the heavens. All right? Pretty good? So, if Jesus ministers as a high priest in this authentic or real sanctuary, the presence of God, what's the nature of his ministry? All right? That's where he, in verse 3, that's where he begins to sort of tick that off. For every high priest is appointed to offer gifts and sacrifices. We get that from Hebrews chapter 5, verse 1. All right? You don't have to turn back, but I'll read it. When we were in chapter 5, one of the things that was the Hebrew writer went to great lengths to explain was that for every high priest chosen from among men, that is the Levites, is appointed to act on behalf of men or the group in relation to God. And then this is at the very end of chapter 5, verse 1. What do? They offer gifts and sacrifices for the sins. Okay? So this is what the Levites did. So, because that's their ministry as a priest. Well, Jesus, as a superior high priest, what's the nature of his ministry? Well, priests by nature offer gifts and sacrifices for what? For sins. So what will that look like for Jesus to do? High priest must offer something. However, we don't get this in chapter 8. We'll get it in chapter 9. But what we'll see is that what Jesus offers or sacrifices is not animals. What he's going to offer is himself. And so in chapter 9, it'll talk about the blood of animals compared to the blood of Christ. Blood as a covering. All right, so think back to your Old Testament Sunday school lessons again. The blood was a source of life. And so the reason why there were animal sacrifices is because life for life, okay? Blood for blood. And instead of it being something temporary to cover animals in the Old Testament, Jesus sacrifices himself, but just as he is superior high priest, his sacrifice is superior compared to the sacrifices of animals. There's a lot of Old Testament here, all right? Why? Because who's he's writing to? He's writing to people who have a framework around the Old Testament. And so he's trying, if you're going to talk to, your children or grandchildren about something that might seem to be complex, you don't talk about it on your level, right? They might not, if you're a mathematician and you want to talk about mathematics to somebody who's a writer, or an English major, probably not going to always get the same understanding, right? So you have to put it in language for the group to understand. Well, what is the Hebrew writer doing? He's putting it in the language of that his people are very familiar with, because he's going to take them out of what they know, because he doesn't want them to fall back. And he's going to say the reason why we don't fall back is because this one that you believe in, this is why we believe. And it is that important because it's that efficacious. It has that level of magnitude. So the first aspect is where Jesus sacrifices compares to, say, where they did it in the Old Testament. Earthly sanctuary, this is, verses 4. The high priest, in the Old Testament, high priest would minister in the earthly sanctuary or the tabernacle or temple. You can take out sanctuary if your Bible has sanctuary, and you can put like a little pencil in tabernacle or temple. That's really what he's talking about. But it was limited to one family, just the Levites, right? Just the descendants of Aaron. But with Jesus, he didn't belong to that family. I mean, he's from a different tribe. What tribe is Jesus from? Tribe of what? Judah. Yeah, not tribe of Levi. Here's the crazy thing: on earth, like in Jesus, in the Gospels, he's not clergy. He's laity. You ever thought about that? Clergy were the priests. Okay. Say that again. I missed that. So I felt like I was drinking something. I missed it. So. Mm-hmm. So the priest would make a sacrifice, so the act of sacrificing is the priest doing it in the presence of God. So on that level, yes. But what the priest sacrificed, it was always for something else. So sometimes the high priest would sacrifice for themselves, like on the Day of the Atonement. They could not go in and make sacrifices for the whole group until they were pure enough to go in. So the first sacrifice on the Day of the Atonement that the high priest would make would be for himself, right? A sin offering for himself, individual. And then after doing that, he would then go in and make a sacrifice on behalf of the whole people. So on that level, a sacrifice is always for something. You're making a sacrifice for something other. All right, whether it be your own sins or for the sins of many. Jesus' sacrifice is not for himself, it is for the sins of many. So, but it's an interaction between God and Jesus, not other people. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yep. So if you can think the way Luther described it, and Luther, I really like Martin Luther on so many things. Luther would if you can imagine, trying to think of a movie that might give us a good, and I just can't. So what took place on the cross, even though it's physical here, also was up there. All right? So, it's kind of a both and type. So you're going to have to get sort of sci-fi, all right, in your mind to kind of think about it. It's even though the death on the cross was here in outside of Jerusalem, the magnitude of it was actually larger than that. So Matthew makes the reason why Matthew talks about the veil being torn, and it's torn from top to bottom, not side to side, right? The veil was this part right here. There was a large curtain in the tabernacle and then in the temple that separated the court of the priests from the Holy of Holies. And in the Holy of Holies was, have you seen Raiders of the Lost Ark? All right, then you got it. All right, so Holy of Holies had something that looked like this, and you had the angel's wing, and inside of that was the Ten Commandments and a couple other things that they lumped in over the time. And then there was a mercy seat where, and then there were all kind of other things in the temple, in the Holy of Holies. But when the priest would make a sacrifice, he would pour the blood on the Holy of Holies. And that's the symbol of what you're talking about, Harriet, of even though, you're doing it here, the blood was the symbol of life to cover the sins. The reason why Matthew talks about the veil being torn from top to bottom was now what used to restrict people from going into the presence of God has been removed. Okay? That's that, and so to use Harriet's question, what took place on the cross here, like outside of Jerusalem on earth, see it there, that one event, but also see it in heaven about the removal of whatever the barrier is, and in this case it would be sin, from now interaction between God and people. All right? So the reason why I asked you that question, do we underplay the magnitude of Jesus as high priest? Because, we, in our ranking, what, and Paul does this, he does a fantastic job. If one tiny little blot is still enough to be a barrier when it comes to the holiness of God. All right? So just think about that. We think we see all the white and probably won't see this. And it's not that God only focuses on this, but if you are absolute, if your holiness is absolute, then anything other than absolute holiness is an infraction. It's kind of like getting close to the sun, Unless you're hotter than the sun, guess what? You're going to burn up. And that's not to be, scary or to frighten folks. So any infraction, and ours are more than just any, our infractions are they're so numerous, can't even, and not just ours, but just the whole of humanity. The fact that now that has been removed with one person's sacrifice once and for all, and it's not a daily sacrifice, or the way the wording, reads in these first couple of verses, it's not like Jesus had to continue to do this over and over and over and over and over. No, it's just one and done. And the way Matthew describes it is that now the veil has been removed, and so what it means is that people, humans, have access to God, and they don't need to fear. Or whether or not one blot is going to get them too close to the sun. Because all blots now have been removed. And not so all blots of the past, all blots that are taking place right now, and then all blots forever in the future. Which is why in the New Testament, the way it talks about saving, that word save, sozo, it interchanges past tense, present tense, future tense, like it's no big deal. To some degree in the person, you were saved. You are being saved at this very moment, and you will be saved in the future. Well, how is that possible? Well, because of this right here. And to use the Hebrew language, this high priest that is far superior than any previous high priest, who only worked in an earthly sanctuary, who worked in the shadows. This one works in the real sanctuary, in the presence of God. All right? So do we underplay the sheer magnitude of the gift that we have been given in Jesus Christ? That's going to be your break, So let's take a break for about 10, 12 minutes or so, and we'll kind of come back and look at some of the latter parts. All right, let's go ahead and come on back. Yeah, well, I wasn't paying attention. I actually have a lunch meeting at 11:30, so we're going to have to break here at probably 11:20, and then I realized we're after 11. So yeah, let's go ahead and come on back in, and we'll jump back in. So again, staying with this theme of Jesus, superior high priest, and so then the ministry of a superior high priest. What does that look like? That's what the author is explaining and elaborating on, and it's going to manifest itself around covenant, sanctuary, and sacrifice. We've spoken before the break about the sanctuary piece. Now in verse 6, he moves, that is the Hebrew writer, he moves now into the covenant piece. So just look back on verse 6 real quick. But as it is, Christ has obtained a ministry that is as much more excellent than the old as the covenant. So see, he's going to zero in on the covenant, that he mediates is better since it is enacted on a better promise. Now, he's going to, 7 says, for if that first covenant was had been faultless, there wouldn't have been a need or occasion to look for a second. So from really, you can just take verse 6 and jump to verse 8. 7 is just he substantiates why the covenant that Jesus mediates is better than the old covenants, because the old covenant had faults. The new covenant does not. When from verse 8 to verse 12 is where he's going to draw from the Old Testament. This is from the book of Jeremiah, of why, what actually is this new covenant. And it's pretty much a quote from Jeremiah 31 through 34. That's really what he's quoting from, which is why probably in your Bible it's not in prose. It's probably set apart because it's an Old Testament quote. And the reason why there's a new covenant is because the old covenant had faults. And, it only covered sins. It did not forgive sins, which is a difference. I mean, it's forgiveness, yes, but forgiveness in anticipation of what Christ would do and the efficacy of his death. So when we talk about predestination, right? So this is a good thing about predestination. That what's been predestined is the means by which God would save, all right, which is Jesus. So when you read in either Old Testament or New Testament, and it talks about what's been predestined from the foundations of the world, all right? So there's this like kind of time lapse, maybe understanding with how sins in the Old Testament, were they forgiven? And if they were, what does that look like? Because Jesus wasn't there yet. And so when we talk about this and say predestination, if you can think like, all right, first sin, Adam and Eve, cross, last sin before second coming. It's like this. And so if you think about this in the form of logic of time, obviously this time period is older than that time period, which is older than that time period. So when we talk about one aspect of predestination, what's been predestined is that the means by which God would deal with the sins of humanity, that was decided a long time ago. It just took a while for that to be manifested in Christ. So if this is Old Testament, and we'll just say this is New Testament and beyond, all the sins of the Old Testament, what Aaron did is in those sacrifices as a shadow of a real sacrifice to come, it covered. Now it talks about it in terms of forgiveness, but they're forgiven knowing that the full payment, to use that language, is coming in the future. Does that make sense? Remember layaway? Buy now, pay later. All right? So you buy it. Layaway, I don't think you got it until you actually paid for it, right? Is that how it works? Now they have something that's called buy now, pay later. You've probably seen that on your credit card bill or something, where you can actually buy something. They give it to you, and then you can make installments that are interest-free. Grant me that terminology, right? It's Christmas time. So, all this, sins are forgiven by God, but the means by which they are to be forgiven, this just sort of like covered them. The means by which they are to be forgiven was coming in Jesus. So when we look about Old Testament, how can sins really be forgiven permanently if there hasn't been one who mediates inside of the real sanctuary? Because the old sanctuary or the tabernacle and temple was just temporary. Well, it's anticipation of what's coming. Does that make sense? Hopefully it does. Yay? Nay? Okay. So maybe buy now, pay later is not the best example. But, if y'all can come up with one, I'll take it. So, so anyway, let's look. So this covenant, so we've talked about sanctuary as in the place. Now we're going to look at the difference between covenants, old covenant compared to new covenant. And that's what the Hebrew writer touches on 8 through 12. So let's look at that. For he finds fault with them when he says, behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will establish what? A new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not like the covenant that I made with their fathers. So Jeremiah, is what he's quoting, is talking about the difference between an old covenant and a different covenant that's now being established, right? So Jeremiah is prophesying about what's to come with the Messiah, all right? So verse 9, it's not like the covenant that was made with their fathers, thinking about Aaron, Mosaic covenant, on the day which I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. So do you see how he's referencing that covenant? He's talking about Mosaic covenant under Moses and Aaron, and that there was something about that covenant that was flawless. That had faults. And he's going to compare it to a covenant that is faultless. For they did not continue in my covenant. He's talking about the children of Israel. And so I showed no concern for them, declares the Lord. For this is the covenant so here now we're moving in verse 10 into the new covenant. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel. After those days, declares the Lord, I will put my laws into what? Into their minds, and then I will do what? Write them on their hearts instead of on a tablet. And I will be their God, and they shall be my people, which, by the way, is the same promise in the old covenant. So when you read in Exodus, it's always, I will be your God, you will be my people. But it's based on their ability to keep the Ten Commandments, right? And they shall not teach each one his neighbor and each one his brother, saying, know the Lord, which is, he's talking about Deuteronomy chapter 6. All right, we'll look at that in just a second. For they shall all know me, for the least of them to the greatest. For I will be merciful towards their iniquities, and I will do what? Remember their sins no more. All right? So here, what we have is this difference between Old Covenant and New Covenant. Both of those have the same promise. I will be their God, they will be my people. But when the Old Covenant was given, it was, so Exodus 19, they pledged themselves to each other. Third time Moses goes up on the mountain, comes back down. That's what the people do. The fourth trip up, Exodus 20, they received the Ten Commandments. So now that we're in covenant with each other, this is how you maintain the covenant. What are they? 10 Commandments. All right? Could not keep them. So there's something faulty about that covenant. So instead of having laws of God on tablets that, according to Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 to 9. All right, let's see if I'm right. The Shema, you ever heard of that? Hear, O Israel, the Lord is one. Does that ring a bell? Just say yes. All right, so so have you ever, you see, anyway, I'll just read it. All right, so 6:4. Deuteronomy 6, chapter 4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. All right, so this is what was taught, and probably still is, in every Jewish home. This is the core foundation of Judaism. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach, this is verse 7, you shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk to them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets, those things you put right here between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorpost of your house and on your gates. So, when Jesus was asked what was the core of the Old Testament, what he quoted was that from Deuteronomy. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Right? And then he said, well, and then the second part of that is because you love the Lord your God this way, you're to love your neighbor as yourself. All right? That's called the Shema. That's the fundamental teaching of the Old Testament. And in the Old Testament, what they were to do, men that is they would write that in Hebrew, put it in a little box, and they'd either put it here, or they'd put it here, or they'd put it on their doorpost, or whatever. It was a constant reminder of what they are to do. All right? So that's Old Testament, and you got a little bit of this play on words between everything in the Old Covenant you wrote and you taught, as if it's external that you have to learn. New Covenant is, I'm going to write it on your heart. You see that? See the difference? And so one of the things that makes New Covenant as superior to Old Covenant, it's now no longer something you have to write and carry with you. It's something that through God's Spirit is imparted on your heart. And so it's for everybody. Do you see the inclusiveness there in the passage that I read? Verses 11. And they shall not teach each one his neighbor and each one his brother, saying, know the Lord. Like, hey, you need to know this, right? No, he said, it's not that. And the reason why you don't do that is because all will know me, from the least to the greatest. Why? Because what has been given to all through this covenant is not something that needs to be written down on a stone tablet or on a sheet of paper and then fixed on your doorpost or on your forehead or on your hand. Now, via God's Spirit, it's written on a heart. So when we think about sanctuary, better sanctuary, because it's in the heavens, not tabernacle or temple. When we think about the purpose of the covenant, it's not something external, now it's something internal. Deuteronomy 6, verses 4 through 9. That's right. Yep, absolutely. But it's internal, so it's not something you have to go hunt for or rely on someone to teach. It's something that God imparts inside the heart of the person. So, just to recap, when we think about Jesus as the superior high priest, chapter 5, chapter 6, chapter 7, the Hebrew writers just, he's beating that drum. He's superior high priest, superior high priest, superior high priest. So when we get to chapter 8, it's like he changes the argument a little bit from now that we know that he is our high priest, what does he do with that? Let's unpack that a little bit. Well, when it comes to sanctuary, the place by which the high priest works, different place, better place, superior place, and the covenant by which the high priest works within. It's not here, it's here. And it's actually something that Jeremiah talked about in his day. It's no longer external, now it's internal. Now, when we get into chapter 9, we're going to talk about, this is what we're going to look at next week. It's going to be about this. All right? So what is this new covenant? God's law is now in the heart. not something that's on a tablet that you got to go and look up somewhere. And so what does that mean? It means now people know God as a personal experience instead of something that is they either read about or something that's external that they have to learn or know or something. This is something that's internal, and the blotting out of sins. Forgiveness, not just covering. So again, here's the question. Do we underplay the efficacy and the magnitude of Jesus as our high priest? Maybe not, but maybe we do. All right, any questions? Chapter 8. Yeah, I think they're called frontlets. I mean, yeah, that's exactly what the box is. The box is they would write down Deuteronomy chapter 6, and they would fold it up and put it in like a little container. And, head being like the source of knowledge, right? I mean, and then hand, and then doorpost being my house is this way, stuff like that. But yeah, that's exactly where that comes from. Oh, yes, ma'am. So, all right, pretty good? Any questions? All right. See y'all next week. Go in peace.